Welcome to the Art of Procurement, the official podcast of the Catalyst Co-community. And our purpose is to enhance the impact of procurement by elevating the discussion one conversation at a time. Here at Art of Procurement, Catalysts come together every single week to share their challenges, ideas, successes, and perspectives on the business of procurement. Hey there, I'm Philip Eidson, the host of the Art of Procurement. Welcome to this week's show. So periodically, I record a short behind-the-scenes podcast. I get a lot of questions about how I pull together the podcast and how I'm growing the business of Art of Procurement. So I wanted to pull all those questions together into an episode and provide everyone some insight really into how everything within Art of Procurement all comes together. So let's get right to it. So we're clear, we talk about this all the time, that what we do at Art of Procurement, it's not for everybody. Now, everybody is a broad term, so I want to narrow it down a little bit of where we focus. Who is Art of Procurement for? And honestly, I started Art of Procurement for professionals like me. So let me define what I consider me to be. Me is being a procurement professional who spent a number of years in the profession, both as an individual contributor and a leader, who is proficient at, or at least I consider myself proficient at, the technical side of procurement and really wanted to level up and create value in new ways. So as we look at, who Art of Procurement is today, it really is somebody who I think has some of the following characteristics. It's somebody who enjoys and embraces change. In fact, somebody who actually wants to spearhead change. It's someone who is interested in their own self-development. That's why they're here. And they want to be exposed to new ideas while challenging or validating existing ones. It's somebody who wants to feel more fulfilled in their work through increasing their impact with stakeholders as well as helping develop those that they work with. It's somebody who has a bias towards action. That's really who I built Art of Procurement for. And it's with that profile or avatar in marketing speak in mind that my team and I actually make decisions on what we do and how we go about doing it. Now, all that being said, for all those who choose to spend some of the time and attention listening to the podcast, we do try and pull together a wide range of topics. So today, as I mentioned, I actually want to share some answers to questions I get asked often regarding how it all comes together. So here are the broad areas that I will be covering today. First of all, what goes into creating an episode of the Art of Procurement? How do I decide who to get behind the mic with me? And how does Art of Procurement actually make money? After all that, I'm going to share a little bit about Catalysco, our new umbrella brand, under which all of the activities that we have going on all will live. So first, let me talk about the process of creating an episode. So it's certainly a lot more involved than just firing up Skype, hitting record. Perhaps naively when I started, I thought that it was a little easier than the process that we've actually ended up mapping out to and that we follow every single week. Now, I'm often asked, what comes first? Is it the guest or is it the topic? And there really isn't a single answer to this. I start the year with several broad themes that I'd like to cover over the course of a year. And then generally speaking, these themes fit into one or a number of a few different buckets. Now this year, the buckets that we've really been focusing on are being a catalyst, so challenging assumptions and provoking or leading change. It's sharpening the saw, so amplifying our foundational, our technical procurement skills, like sourcing, category management, and risk management, in service of generating greater, perhaps more strategic impact for our stakeholders and our organizations. The next category is owning the future, so understanding possible procurement delivery models to the future, how we can realign our skill sets to thrive in what's really rapidly changing environment rather than be negatively impacted by it. We look at how to make a difference. How can we create a stronger customer-centric value proposition? We consider leaving a mark. So looking at paths that we can take and practices we can adopt that help us evolve into strong leaders, particularly by helping others realize their potential. And these are all areas that we really set out on the beginning of the year. And I did a podcast right at the beginning of the year that talked about some of these content areas that we really look at building the shows around. So sometimes the guest comes first. It may be somebody that I'm familiar with or that I'm introduced to. And then we just pick a topic that they have something valuable to share about. And sometimes the topic comes first, where we actually research to find potential guests related to a topic and then invite them to participate in the podcast. And a recent example of that one was Rory Sutherland, when we had Rory on the show to talk about behavioral economics. Now, to provide some perspective, when I started Art of Procurement, my primary methods at that point of getting a guest would either be to find an article that resonated with me and ask them onto the show to talk about it, or invite people that I knew of or that I looked up to within our community that I wanted to learn from. I'm fortunate that today we do have a much more structured approach, and it's built around that content calendar that I talk about. So today I mostly find guests in one of the following ways. So first, it may be through personal interest. Like the early days, I'll hear or read something that they have written that's of interest to me and that I just believe will make for an interesting discussion. I may have referrals from past guests. There may be past guests who I invite back onto the show. Maybe that we talked a lot off mic and we just didn't cover everything in the episode, or we had a number of different topic areas that I really wanted to cover with that guest. So one of my greatest sources of guests today comes from partnerships with conference providers. One of the biggest benefits of these partnerships with companies like SIG and ProcureCon, and there's a few others as well, is that it really helps bring practitioner-side guests onto the show. Because honestly, I want as many practitioners on the show as I possibly can get, but there's often a lot of red tape that exists with internal communication teams that has already been covered, or at least begun to be explored, to allow a guest to talk at a conference, and just makes it that little bit easier. There is cold outreach. I get a number of requests from folks to be on the show, which is fantastic. It's what I dreamed of, to be honest, when I really started the show. Most, I would say, are from the service provider side, which is great. I'm not knocking that, because service providers spend so much time in a particular market or within a niche topic that they have the insights of working across multiple clients. They can often see particularly effective ways of addressing a problem, trends that companies are having successes with, and importantly, failures with, by using, tactics and strategies that they see across multiple different companies. What we do strive to do with guests from service providers is to make sure that the conversation is based around thought leadership rather than their product or their service. And I think that we've mostly got this right. I think there's probably been a couple of occasions where I've had to get the edit button out for guests that inadvertently were a bit too promotional. But, it's really important to us to make it about that thought leadership, as I said, rather than it being, a glorified advert for a product or service that they may be selling. Now, on the topics of guest, if you are interested in being a guest, or if you know of somebody you feel would be a good guest, I really would love to hear from you, because that's really a great opportunity for us to talk to more people, to bring more people onto the show. And being introduced from listeners, it's going to be about topics that a listener is interested about. When you do reach out, I just ask, or when a potential guest, if it's not yourself but you've connected them with me, if they do reach out, I would just ask for the following information, because this really helps us. One is just a little bit about the topic that you or the guest that you suggest would like to talk about. One is why that topic is important to you, how you believe the Art of Procurement listener will gain value from the conversation, and then bullet points on any proposed specific areas of discussion. I ask that because we get a lot of requests, and it's sometimes can be hard until we do a lot more digging to really determine whether it's a topic area that would be appropriate for Art of Procurement listeners. Now, once we've identified a guest that we believe is a good fit for the podcast, and the guest is interested in being on the show, then here's just a little bit about how the process works, the general process that we follow. So first, I have what I call a pre-interview with a guest. So that's a 30 to 60 minute discussion, usually 30, where we get to know each other, if we don't know each other already. And it's where I get a much better sense of the suitability for the podcast. We go over the ground rules of thought leadership, versus commercial discussions. And then we spend a lot of time discussing possible themes and possible topics. There's a lot of great content in these pre-interviews. And so if you sometimes hear me refer to when we talked off mic or we talked before the show, it's some things that I often say in an interview. I'm typically referring to the pre-interview, and I'm trying to draw out some of the great conversation that we actually had in the pre-interview, which, sometimes guests can be a lot more relaxed in that pre-interview than when we're doing the show themselves. After the pre-interview comes the research process. So we'll have agreed on an overarching theme during the pre-interview, and so now I'll do any research that might be necessary so that I can help myself really ask more informed questions. So that research might be on the guest's background, it might be on the topic itself, could be a combination of both. So next, armed with that pre-interview information and the research, I'll then create a narrative arc for the show. And if you're a long-time listener, you'll recognize the following flow. We start by talking about the guest and their background, what's their experience, their habits, perhaps some of their thinking on the future or a particular challenge that they're facing. And I do that because I think it really helps build a relationship with the guest, and it provides context for the rest of the discussion. This is also the place in the show where I ask my signature question: did you choose procurement, or did procurement choose you? The middle part of the interview is then the main topic, and there may be 2 or 3 lines of questioning within that part. That's really the meat of the interview. And then finally we wrap up. And this is where I like to bring out at least one action item and provide ways for listeners to connect with the guest. That action item is really important because if nothing else, I know it can sometimes be difficult to listen to an entire podcast, especially when you're listening, when you're driving, commuting, in the gym, or going for a walk, whatever it may be. It's sometimes difficult to actually translate the information that you're hearing and the discussion you're hearing with action. And so at least asking for and drawing out one action item at the end gives something that you can take away at the end of the show. After the interview is recorded, we then move to post-production. We lightly edit for content. I mentioned before if it gets overly commercial, for example, or there may just be some topics, or we may have talked about a question perhaps too long. We do a little bit of editing along those lines. And then for practitioners, we work with the guest's internal communications team where necessary to just make sure that they're comfortable with the final edit. The great news is that we've never had a single episode where an internal communications team has requested any changes. I put that success down to the pre-interview and the offer to provide questions in advance of the interview. What I'd never want to do is put a guest in a position where they might say something that they would regret. With post-production done, we schedule and publish. Once it's published, I hear a lot from guests that listeners reach out to them, and I just think that's awesome. So I would always encourage you, if you hear a guest on the show that you like, that resonated with you, please do reach out to them. It just really makes everything that we do worthwhile to hear that engagement is taking place outside of the podcast. I think we have honed this process pretty well. What I don't think we do well is actually publicize the podcasts. Honestly, part of that is simply the struggle to find the time to do that effectively. And I think I was probably more effective at doing this in the earlier days than I have been in the last year or so. So here's a shameless ask. If you like the pod, please tell a colleague or leave a review on iTunes. Word of mouth, as I've found, is the number one way that a podcast grows its audience, because it's not something that goes viral. It takes somebody a while to invest in actually listening to a podcast and deciding if it's something that they like. It's not something that oftentimes you will click on and decide in 2 minutes if it's for you. So word of mouth just helps so much in how we grow our audience. Reviews in iTunes, on the other hand, they just help others to find us if they're searching for procurement podcasts. When it comes to this podcast production process, it's actually something that we've followed for almost 3 years now. And To be honest, I'm thinking of shaking up the narrative arc a little, maybe moving towards a more action-oriented type of conversation, perhaps going to shorter conversations. It's always a hard one to change something that at least seems to be working. So as ever, I would love to hear your thoughts on that, whether something shorter rather than longer would make sense for you, whether we should just keep it as it is. The other thing that we create on an almost weekly basis, and it should be weekly, honestly, but there have been occasions where I haven't got this out the door, is our This Week in Procurement newsletter. Now, this started as the Saturday Link Fest, so just a collection of interesting articles that I'd read in a particular week. It's morphed into its current iteration, where I attempt to play out a particular theme before going into the links. The newsletter is great for us because it helps us stay current on key themes, industry happenings, and honestly is a bit of a scouting tool for new episodes. Over time, we've developed a process and custom built a tool to actually help us with the process of finding good articles. That being said, I'll be honest and say that the quality of writing that's targeted at procurement professionals is pretty mixed. As we see hundreds of articles each week with a procurement target audience, or at least that I feel are targeted at procurement professionals. And I feel that so much of it is written just for SEO purposes or pay for play. And don't get me started on pay for play. So that curation, I think, really serves a value, and it helps us as well really identify the best of the best from procurement writing in a particular given week. So if you ever come across an article that you've found lots of value from, just let me know, because odds are if you find value from it, then the rest of the readers of our newsletter will do. So I'd love to include it. And as ever, if you ever have any feedback on how we can improve, I want to hear that too, because I'm always looking at ways to evolve the newsletter to make it more effective. Another common question is about my experience as an interviewer. So as you know, I'm a procurement professional first, and I just happened to pick up a mic and start interviewing, basically. It was a skill that I wanted to learn, but I also saw it as a good way of communicating and connecting, and I often struggle with writing. I definitely get periods of writer's block, and being in front of a mic just seemed a little bit easier for me, at least personally. And so after leaving my corporate job and setting up the business, I joined an online training program. It was called Interview Your Heroes, and it was from somebody called Andrew Warner. So I'd followed Andrew for a long, long time before actually deciding to quit the day job and set up my own business. Andrew hosts a popular podcast that's aimed at entrepreneurs and small business owners, and it's called Mixergy. And so it was from Andrew that I actually basically learned all the things that I put into practice today, from the process to the narrative arc of an episode. But for my interviewing skills themselves, I definitely still feel that they're in their infancy. I think part of that is because, I'm such a strong believer that we can always grow and learn and develop. There's always something that we can invest in to get better. Also because it's just not something, it's not a skill that I had from earlier in my career. It's something that I've learned over the past 2 or 3 years. So I still try and learn and develop with every interview that passes. My current focus is to actually be a little less prepared. I went back to those questions that I set out before. I want to be less prepared in my questions, actually, so that the conversations can be more fluid. That doesn't mean less prepared from a research perspective, but it's really easy when you get into the flow of doing an interview to just look at the questions you have down on the piece of paper and not actually listen. So important to listen and ask really good follow-up questions, and I still feel that I really have some work to be as good as I want to be in that area. Okay, so the next question I get asked is, so you host a podcast, how do you actually make money? And I mostly get asked this question at conferences. I actually get it a lot as well from guests of the show when we're doing our pre-interview, or when I explain to people that I quit a great corporate job to start a podcast. I didn't strictly do that. The podcast became a part of the business, not the business. But people look and say, doing a podcast doesn't seem to be like a great way of earning a living. I'm not going to lie, it hasn't been easy to figure out how to responsibly exchange value for dollars. I've been experimenting with a number of different ways over the course of the last 3 years. My family's financial health is definitely fully invested in my team and in figuring out the answer to the question and then articulating in a way that really makes the value proposition of what we do clear. And that's just that's always ongoing. We're always trying, experimenting in the way that we communicate. Now, as I record this, which is in the last week of August 2018, there are 4 main ways that we work with individual professionals and enterprise. Everything we do is aimed at elevating impact. And so, in no particular order, first we have a procurement advisory offer. It's currently branded as Palambridge, which provides on-demand access to a pre-vetted ecosystem of subject matter experts. This is really aimed at procurement organizations whose impact is challenged by lack of supply market insight. So it's like having an analyst in your corner, but for everything that you buy, especially for those organizations who may only buy certain things, particularly in indirect procurement, once every 3 years, once every 5 years, just whenever the contract comes up for renewal. We provide structured on-site workshops where we help procurement organizations develop a roadmap for the next phase of their evolution. So whether it be to increase the scope of their impact, move from tactical to strategic, take things to the next level, or just develop a strategic plan to meet next year's savings goals. We build those structured workshops just to help it really become clear what the actions need to be that should be taken to maximize the chance of success in that next goal. As well as the structured workshops, we also lead structured lunch and learn sessions. So these are on a range of topics. These ones are typically provided remotely. They certainly have a bias towards action and are focused on specific topics. So, for example, partnering for innovation. And then last, but by no means least, we have a learning and development offer, which is the Catalyst co-platform, or TCP. And we first piloted the concept as a customized project for a large international procurement operation with about 500 procurement professionals. TCP has now evolved to the point where we have 3 different versions: a bespoke version designed for enterprise deployment, team version created for companies with procurement teams of less than 50 professionals, and a version for the individual professional. And as you may have heard if you listened to last week's show, we're actually opening up early access to TCP for a maximum of 50 professionals. And this is going to be a one-time offer. The early access program is scheduled to start on September the 17th. And you can just check out artofprocurement.com/TCP for more details, or it's going to be in the show notes for episode 199. So what about monetizing the podcast more directly through partnering with a procurement services company? And the traditional way that a podcaster monetizes their podcast is through advertising. It's actually the way that I thought that I would be able to help the Art of Procurement self-sustain itself from an investment perspective when I started. And so I experimented a couple of years ago with advertising, and I've pursued it off and on since then, I would say, but I've never really, since that experiment a couple of years ago, pulled the trigger again. Now, consuming as much content as I do, I just see that there's a lot of content that's created that's essentially adverts or advertorials. It goes back to my comment before about some of the quality of procurement writing. And it masquerades as thought leadership or news. In some cases, it's labeled as such, it's labeled sponsored content, but many other times it's not, or it's so discreet that you don't actually notice it. And I really don't want there to be even a hint of perception that the podcast contains sponsored content. And so I haven't really found an advertising model yet that I'm comfortable with. And in fact, I do get a lot of inbound requests to work with service providers, but again, I've struggled to find ways to do that in a responsible way that doesn't challenge, or at least be perceived to challenge, which I think is really important too, our editorial independence. And what we are looking at is a brand new approach to the webinar experience that's built around engagement, and we'll brand that Art of Procurement Live. Now, how many times have you signed up to a webinar because of an interesting title, and shown up to be disappointed? Then you start getting blasted with random sales emails, or showing up the next day at work and getting a call from a sales rep trying to set up a demo whose company you attended a webinar for yesterday. This offer is still in its development phase, but we're working on an idea to bring longer-term engagement that's much more of a win-win for both the sponsor and the participant in a webinar. Watch this space for more. And if you're a procurement services company, you're thinking about how we can get better engagement in our webinars, and I have piqued your interest in this, drop me a line and I'll be happy to share a little bit more information. So the final question I wanted to cover, and this is a question I've only been getting for the last week or two as we started to come out into the open with this, is what's Catalystco? So you may have started to see the term Catalystco. We have been using it internally for some time. And I think last week in the podcast with Bill Michaels, that was the first time we really used the word Catalystco and the brand Catalystco in the outside world. Simply put, Catalystco is the new name that brings together all of our endeavors and offers that my team and I are working on. Now, if you recall from an earlier pod, we talked about catalysts as being professionals who provoke or speed significant change or action. The Catalystco community, you heard that being referred to at the intro of the show. The Art of Procurement is now the official podcast of the Catalystco community. Well, that Catalystco community is you. It's fellow travelers on this road to help elevate the impact of procurement through the choices that we make, through the mark that we leave, and in service of being more fulfilled in our daily lives. So whether it's the Art of Procurement podcast, the structured ways that we bring to help increase the impact through actions we take, our consulting or coaching activities, they all fall under the umbrella of Catalystco. Now you're going to start to see the name cropping up more and more as we move all of our activities under a common brand, just something that will really take place over the remainder of 2018. Well, that's today's show. Something a little bit different. I don't do these behind the scenes episodes very often, but it's something I always enjoy doing. And I really wanted to talk about the podcast production process because it's something that just really seems to spark a lot of conversation when I'm talking to folks, and especially at events, especially when I'm having kind of introductory calls. So I just thought it may be interesting to put it out there and share with you how we go, look behind the scenes at some of the nuts and bolts of creating a podcast. I hope we provided some interesting insights in how we pull everything together. If you have questions that I didn't touch on, I'd love to hear from you. We can make those part of the next behind the scenes episode that we do. And the easiest way to do that is either just connect with me on LinkedIn or drop me a note at contact@artofprocurement.com. Well, with all that being said, one final time to wrap up, I just hope you have a great week. We'll be back next week with another great interview. Until then, take care. Thank you for listening to another episode of The Art of Procurement. To find an archive of all past episodes, you can go to artofprocurement.com/episodes. And to ensure you never miss another show, go to artofprocurement.com/subscribe.